Du Fu was a poet back in 8th century China, that's right, isn't it? At the time of Beowulf in this country. But Michael, I wondered if we could start by you telling us what led you to write this book. Why Du Fu and why this book?
It's a really long story, actually, Anne, but because it actually begins when I was 15 at school in Manchester, and Penguin Classics published the late Tongue poetry in a beautiful little translation of a selection of Tongue poetry, and the first and the star of the collection was Du Fu, and I, in the bookshop, opened the book, and do you have that experience yourself when you come across a book that opens up a world that you never even dreamed existed? And that's the impact it had on me. And I took it home and I thought, wow, there's a kind of poetry and a literature that I know nothing about and is so extraordinary. And indeed, in the beginning of the book, Arthur Graham gives you a little explanation of how the poetry actually works in Chinese. You know, the syntax and it's so different from Western poetry. So I always loved him and often gave that book as a present to people. And then in 2014, we got a chance to make a big series of films called The Story of China for the BBC, and we did a sequence on him then. And then, after we'd done that, and we'd done some more filming in China, I just said to the BBC, what about doing a film in the footsteps of Du Fu? And right at the moment that the COVID outbreak happened in China, I went and did that journey. And the film...
in the footsteps, it's because Du Fu travelled a lot in his life. His life was an extraordinary journey physically, wasn't it?
It's an amazing story because a man who was of high society, very high education, a career path in the highest levels of the bureaucracy was probably there for him, but in a series of disasters culminating in the great civil war of An Lushan, everything dissolved. You know, the Chinese censuses have 30 million people missing on the censuses in the 13 years of the period. And Du Fu, in the end, struggling with trying to get menial jobs and everything, he fell really on the favor of his friends and family, and he took his own family and he wandered, and the wanderings cover this great arc around China, through the westwards from Xi'an and down over the mountains to Sichuan, where he lived in Chengdu for 4 years. Then the amazing journey when he goes on by boat all the way down the Yangtze River and through the Yangtze Gorges, and so on. And he never got home. He never found the kind of Ithaca, if I can put it that way, that he dreamed he might once get back to the old family home near Luoyang and the garden and so on. But he died still wandering. So his life becomes a kind of a parable. He's an exile. One of his children even dies of starvation. So the man who had known the highest level of beauty and sophistication in the greatest civilization in the world in the 7th century, 8th century, knew what it was like to be at the poorest level of society. I often, in thinking of Western parallels, you think of Shakespeare's King Lear and out in the storm, stripped of everything and discovering what it is like to be a naked, unaccommodated man. And Du Fu's greatest poetry is actually many great poems, but is about the suffering of the common people in a time of terrible war and suffering. And I was finishing it off when the Ukraine invasion happened and the siege of Mariupol, and there on the screen on the news you saw ordinary Ukrainians talking about what was happening to them. And Du Fu, with amazing ventriloquy, actually kind of takes the persona of the suffering poor And
But it's quite extraordinary, isn't it, at the time that he was writing, when you consider what was happening in literature in other parts of the world. I mean, the surviving literature that we have from that period in Europe, for example, we talked about Beowulf. Well, it's mostly about the great and the good, the grand names.
Yeah.
It's very rare that small people are written about, that people who don't have a great status. And that, to me, was quite radical reading his work, because, yes, you draw a parallel with Shakespeare, but Shakespeare was 800 years later, or 700 years later. I mean, it's really quite extraordinary. I wonder if you could give us an example of this writing about the human experience, because it is so powerful.
Yeah, I'll read you a little bit of this very, very famous poem here, 500 words, or in Chinese, 500 characters, on the road to Fengxian. And he's in a time of, this is before the civil war has broken out, but things are already in disaster with famine and floods and death, and he's sent the family for safety, his impoverished family for safety to relatives in a village out in the wilds, and he tries to reach them. At the year's ending, a bitter wind scours the high ridges. Can you hear me at the back? Is this okay? I set out, a lone traveller at midnight, my fingers too cold to tie my broken belt. At dawn, I passed the imperial palace. Here at the hot springs, the emperor entertains his court, and music echoes around the hills. Only the rich and powerful may bathe here, but the silk they wear was woven by poor people. Women whose husbands are beaten for their taxes. The halls are full of ladies as fair as goddesses. The scent of perfume moves with each captivating figure, clothed in warm furs of sable, entertained with the finest music, pipes and strings, fed with camel hump soup and oranges ripened in the frost. Behind the red lacquered gates, wine is left to sour, meat to rot. Outside the gates lie the bones of the frozen and the starved. When I got home, wailing rose in the house. My infant child had died of hunger. Why should I hold back my grief when even the neighbors in the village are crying for us? I'm ashamed of being a father, so poor that I caused my son to die for lack of food. How could I have known that the autumn harvest still could not save the poor from disaster? And I'm one of the privileged. If my life is so bitter, then how much more, how much worse is the life of the common people? And that's a voice that he when we were in Chengdu in the gardens of Du Fu's thatched cottage, which is, the site is still preserved and it is in the right place, several people spoke to me about, I said, why do you like him? Why does he still matter to the Chinese people? And there is that voice, which is the voice of the common people. And that's why they still love him. Educated people do still today.
Now, some people writing about this extraordinary writer, I mean, the material, there's so much that survives. 14,000 poems.
1,400.
14, I beg your pardon.
1,400. Yeah.
And amazingly, only brought into English in 2016, the full collection.
Yeah.
But some people would have just used that as the source to write a book. Why did you feel it was necessary to make the journey? What did that add?
Well, if you've seen any of my films before, I think the journey, we're in a travel writers festival, and a journey has its own narrative and its own arc of narrative, if you like. And I've made a lot of films over the years which have had journeys as their component part. It's an act of discovery, and if you're presenting a series of films like that, you become the cipher through which the audience can follow the camera through the landscape. And sometimes it's a great way of doing history. I mean, I did a series quite a long time ago now called In the Footsteps of Alexander the Great. And we followed the route of Alexander from Greece through 14 countries, from Afghanistan to Central Asia, Pakistan and India. And of course, if you want a way of explaining how this event unfolded, what better way than traveling? I did a series on the Spanish conquest of the New World called Conquistadors, which has been seen in 150 countries and territories across the world. And each one of the films, Cortés, Francisco Pizarro in Peru, Gonzalo Pizarro in Orellana in Amazonia, Cabeza de Vaca in United States and Mexico. Some of the most incredible stories in history. But when you actually follow in the footsteps, things are revealed which are never revealed on the page. And so I've always been a great believer in journeys, and you can do it with poets too. I mean, we've done, even with Shakespeare, we did a bit of that, you know, but he didn't have a very, you know, going between London and Stratford and kind of UK tours of the King's Men. I don't think he travelled any further than that. But, you know, we did a film about Ovid, the great Roman poet, for his 2000th anniversary, and went out to the Black Sea to follow him to his place of exile.
But I mean, with Dufu, there was a challenge. I mean, Ovid, presumably a similar challenge, but Dufu, being so long ago, 13 centuries ago, there was, and you say in the book, the risk, you were worried that all traces may have been erased because China has changed so much.
Yeah.
How did you get past that? In some places that was the case. A lot had gone.
Yes, yeah. I mean,
you use the word new old in
the
the
new
book.
old, yeah.
What is that?
The new old is a phrase you get in China all the time. You know, they kind of, even old things can be, the local authority and the government can demolish them to create a modern version of the same thing. You can't believe they do this. You know, everywhere. The ancient past is in danger from that, and I was worried in setting out that this fond fantasy of kind of travelling in Dufu's footsteps, that we wouldn't be able to catch that feel of the past, but it was possible, especially in the countryside. I mean, the extraordinary thing was that when Dufu died unknown, effectively. His poetry was widely circulated among people who love poetry, but he was an unknown. And then in the century after he died, people started to say that he was the greatest. And that, a wonderful account of him was written 3 generations later, saying since the beginning of poetry, there's no one like him. And then people started to follow his track and mark the places where things had happened. So the place where the thatched hut, he built a thatched hut on borrowed land outside Chengdu and lived there for 4 years with his family. And the place was marked. And it is the place. The archaeology has shown exactly what the history of it is, you know.
And one of his descendants still guards his tomb,
in the place where he died, one of his descendants still guards the tomb. So in places, you could be absolutely in the place. In others, I mean, the cover of the book shows you a wonderful photograph of the Yangtze Gorges taken before the creation of the Three Gorges Dam only 20 years ago, or when it was completed. And this was the most important moment of his life, perhaps, in some respects, because that's where he wrote his greatest poetry. 400 poems when he was living in the gorges. But you go there today, of course, and you can't see what he saw because the water has risen 500 feet, so the landscapes are erased. But it's still a very atmospheric place. And actually, my solution was to get hold of wonderful black and whites from travellers in the 19th century. Some of them are hand-tinted like these. And so the book is full of these fantastic images of the landscape. So where the modern world has intruded, as filmmakers, you always look for a way of getting in on it, and that was crucial, and we did.
Well, Dufu wrote "The landscape remains," doesn't he? And you quote that in your book and use that as a sort of compass for exploring some of his
that's
experience.
Right. Yeah, the most famous line of Dufu. 我破山河在, the state is destroyed, but the landscape remains. The country remains. The country remains. The state is destroyed. Absolutely fantastic poem, and known to all Chinese people. It has incredible resonance and has had an incredible resonance all the way through history, through the rise and fall of different dynasties, the cataclysms that have sometimes overtaken China. But even though the state is destroyed, the landscape, the country rather, remains. And I took that as my motto when I was in some of the rather dismal places that we stayed in. But the Chinese countryside is still, it's very, very rich and beautiful. And if you're a traveler these days, you can stay in, you can even stay in private houses that are licensed. And there's lovely, B&Bs with Italian coffee machines and Wi-Fi and all that. So it is possible to get down to the grassroots in China. And of course, it's a really lovely thing to do because the Chinese people are so great and they're so hospitable. I thoroughly recommend traveling at a grassroots level in China if you can.
Now, Du Fu's writing is incredibly engaging, but his life story and his character, certainly as you present him, is really engaging. I mean, he is quite he's a colourful character, isn't he? Although he's clearly an extraordinarily talented poet, he wasn't great at everything he did. I mean, you mentioned about the a potential career in the civil service, but actually he failed his exams, didn't he?
Twice. He failed his civil service exams twice. And of course, among Chinese littérateurs and scholars and all that, there's been an intense debate over a very long time as to why somebody who was so great could have failed his exams. And my intuition is that actually, it's not that he couldn't be bothered, it's just that he hated doing things the way they want him to do it. Because when he did get a low-level civil service job, he was reprimanded for kind of talking too much and kind of, he'd got a job as a reminder, which was to point out defects in other people's writings, and he was just told rather bluntly not to remind so much. I think he was his own man, and he just would not do things the way that he was expected to do things.
I mean, it has to be said, the exams were pretty grueling as well, weren't they? They were a 3-day marathon, and you had a latrine bucket. You had to be in the room for 3 days and just... I mean, it sounds pretty grueling for anyone, really.
And you had to provide answers that were what the civil service expected you to do. The exams were there, as they were in Western culture for quite a long time, to underwrite the ideology of the state, But so it was a great personal cost, really, that he
was also rather fond of alcohol, wasn't he? I mean, he writes quite young in his life.
He admits that early on.
You say at one point in the book, evidently being Du Fu was never easy. He gets drunk and has arguments with people. And And unlike Shakespeare, we do actually know quite a lot about his life. Shakespeare is a bit of a mystery. We know about the second best bed, but that's about it. Whereas Du Fu, there is an extraordinary amount of information, really.
Yes. If you look at the poetry carefully, you can see the curve of his life and the ups and downs, and sometimes he's rather self-pitying, and he rubs people up the wrong way sometimes. He loves his family, loves his children. There are beautiful poems about his wife and children. But he's fabulously eccentric in some ways. There was nothing which wasn't the subject of poetry to him. So he writes about his faithful old horse who'd been with them through thick and thin, and he just talks about, you've been so wonderful to me, and I've got to write a poem about you. He writes poetry about planting lettuces. He writes poetry about sustainable fishing when he sees the eggs of fish on a market stall. He's saying, this is wrong, we have to, there's nothing which is not a subject for poetry in his writing, and that's really really great. And he writes poems about his servants and
his wife as well, which was quite radical at the time. Wasn't unusual to write love poetry in that way at the time.
It was as if he was cut free of many of the requirements that were needed if you were going to be a professional literateur in the governing class. You know, he sort of wrote.
That slightly maverick tendency.
He wrote what he wanted. Yeah.
Yeah. And also, what comes across very strongly is how engaged he was with all the arts and how they all fed into his process, his development as an artist. There's a lovely poem from early in his life about observing the sword dance, or how he observed the sword dance as a young boy.
Yeah.
I wondered if you wanted to give us a taste of that.
You know, in Chinese, in fact, Xuanzong, the emperor, at the time used this phrase, the three perfections, which was poetry, painting, and calligraphy. And Du Fu, of course, was a calligrapher, a poet. He could play a musical instrument. A lot of his poetry would have been set to music, and in fact there is a still living tradition of the singing of his songs in certain parts of China. But there's an absolutely wonderful poem that he writes, and he writes quite long introductions to some of his poems, as if he was very anxious that you understand exactly how this poem came to be. If only we had that for Shakespeare. But and this one, he's talks about going to see a dancer on the 15th of November, 767. So he's in his late 50s by then. And he sees the dancer in the governor's house in the gorges. And he's transfixed by this wonderful performance because he's seen it before, he thinks. And he goes and he says, and I went and I asked her, where did you learn to dance? To the dancer. And the dancer says, I was a pupil of the great dancer, Gong Sun. And Du Fu is so moved by this because as a 5-year-old child, he'd seen that dancer in one of the aristocratic houses of Xi'an before all the horrors destroyed the world, you know. And it really affects him. But what's so great about it is he makes these comparisons with, he talks about a famous calligrapher who'd seen the same dancer and whose calligraphy took on a new freedom in having seen this dancer. And he just very briefly here, he talks about Gong Sun. Her sword dance astonished the world. The audiences crowded around, awestruck as she danced. And to their reeling senses, the world seems to go on rising and falling long after she'd finished dancing. When she bent back, you saw 9 suns falling, shot down by the god of archers. When she leapt, you imagined gods astride flying dragons in the cloud. When she advanced, you expected thunder and lightning from a gathering storm. And when she stopped, you saw the cool light over a vast, calm sea. So that's how he remembers as an old man, seeing the dancer when he was 5 years old. So he's remembering the 5-year-old's incredibly powerful memory of this great artist. And what's so intriguing is that in his old age, he makes these comparisons with other forms of art, and indeed with his own art, you know.
Now, obviously, you're reading an English translation there. You're not a fluent Chinese speaker, but you do talk about language in the book and talk about the difficulty of trying to understand as an English speaker how Du Fu's poetry works when there are so many differences between Chinese and English. I mean, the lack of genders and tense being not working at all as we're used to. How did you navigate that as someone who doesn't speak fluent Chinese? How do you write about that process, about the language and translation in that way?
Well, I obviously did talk to Chinese friends about the meaning of certain poems that I was really keen to focus on. But in a sense, the book's about translation, and it's about how do we as a non-Chinese speakers engage with a poet who, in the opinion of those who know, is as great as Shakespeare or Dante, you know. And so my concern was really to try and communicate to us, as best as I could attempt it, what it is about him and why he's so great. And therefore I made a lot of comparisons with Western poets, which I hope will make sense and be meaningful to Western readers. To give you one example, you know, he wrote about the horrors of war, a lot of, and I was terribly struck by the analogy with the First World War poets. You know, in all languages in Europe, especially in German and French and English, you've got great poetry by poets who went through the First World War, died in the First World War, and who expressed their horror at what had happened to Western civilization, the ideals of Western civilization. How could it have come to this? And some really great poetry came out of Western Europe at that time. And sometimes even bridges with Chinese. You know, Ezra Pound's famous set of poems, Cathay, was published in 1915. The same year that Freud wrote on mourning and melancholia, which is really is partly about how you can mourn as deeply for the ideals of a civilization as you can for a loved one, the death of a loved one. It can be so powerfully traumatizing to lose those ideals. Freud was writing in the middle of the First World War. Du Fu's writing the same. And he talks about, I don't understand why I feel as if I want to cry all the time. And he records that in his poems. And I felt those kind of analogies, it's risky. I mean, as you know, you've written about translation.
Yeah.
But it's risky to make such analogies. But I felt in terms of the First World War, that was an interesting way of looking.
Yeah.
And the way great poets use language as well. You know, there's a comparison with, you know, Shakespeare. And
well, you say in the book, as I journeyed, it became clear that we really do live in one world, that culture is global, and that literature breaks across the boundaries of translation to speak to us all. And I wondered if that for you is obviously Du Fu has brought that out as a thought for you, but travel itself, does that demonstrate that universality for you, or are there things that are always, barriers, differences that we always have to respect?
Yeah, I think there are things, obviously, that will never be open to any of us who don't read Chinese. But the commonality extends over such a huge area in terms of human values and sense of justice and empathy, or all these other things, sense of love of life, there's so many things which are so we can all share, that I think that's where translation really can work. Actually, the beginning of all this, I'd done the films, and I'd greatly admired the ongoing translation being done in French by Nicolas Chapuis. And I really admired him. And I'd seen one or two of his talks online. He was the EU ambassador in Beijing. And so I took the bull by the horns, and I wrote to him sending a little draft. And I said, look, I've done this film about Du Fu, and I think I want to do a book which talks about, tells the story of his life, but talks also about this question of the value of translation. This is my draft. Will you tell me honestly if you think it's a waste of time? You know, you're writing the greatest edition of Du Fu in a Western language that will ever be, probably. And he wrote back very generously saying, no, I don't think it's a waste of time at all. In fact, I think the value of translation is absolutely huge, because it really does break over the boundary and enables all of us to appreciate the wonders of the great artists in other cultures that are not accessible to us. And actually, having spent so long thinking about Du Fu and done the book and everything else, I look back at him now, and I think I admire him even more. I think he's even greater than I imagined, I think.
You mentioned earlier about visiting some of the key sites and meeting Chinese people on literary pilgrimages there. I wondered, the literary pilgrimage, how common an idea is that in China? Is it just Du Fu who gets this treatment, or is it common for people to go on these kind of literary journeys?
Yeah. Internal tourism in China is absolutely ginormous. I mean, hundreds of millions of people probably go around on internal tourism in China. And literary tourism is very important, because the Chinese are very appreciative of their artists and great figures of the past. Poetry for them is a very, very important aspect of... The poets are the truth tellers in China. Whatever the dangers and the hardships of particular regimes through the whole of Chinese history, the poets are the truth tellers. So internal tourism to the residences, or the former residences of poets, is really important. Li Qingzhao, for example, the greatest Chinese female poet, one of the greatest poets in the world. I think there's 4 memorial residences over China for the different points of her life. And when you go to Chengdu, the biggest of the Dufu sites, you've got to dive in at 7:30 in the morning to avoid there being a lot of people, even on a rainy day. It's not even the biggest literary pilgrimage in China. The biggest, in my experience, is Lu Xun, who is the great writer of the 1920s and 1930s in Shaoxing. And it's absolutely, it's Stratford upon Avon with knobs on, really. It's absolutely amazing. But brilliant. The houses are brilliant, and they're the real houses, the family houses from the 19th century. And I don't knock them at all, actually. They're very, very well done. And the thatched house, of course, of Dufu is reconstructed. But it's on the same spot that was identified in around 900.
Wow, yeah, amazing. Well, we're going to open up to audience questions now. Does anyone have a question for Michael that they would like to ask? We have a roving mic going around. Any hands? Anyone? Yes, there's a gentleman over here. Mic is on its way. There we go.
I was very interested when I think you said at the beginning, if I heard rightly, that in the census of this civil war in the 7th or 8th century, 30,000 people went missing.
30 million.
13 million.
Are missing from the censuses. That's refugees, displaced people, dead, famine, killed in war. Yeah.
So even then, they had accurate records of everybody in the country.
Yes. Yeah.
Incredible.
Yeah. The Tang Dynasty is greatest civilization in the world, probably, you would say, along with Byzantium in the 8th century. But it is, and it goes much further back than the Tang. Even in the first times of the first emperor, you've already got incredible grassroots documentation of people.
It puts us in our place.
Yes.
Yeah. And it's
China
humbling as well,
generally does.
And it's actually quite humbling to think how these mighty civilizations can fall as well, because I think it's salutary for all of us to consider that.
Yeah. But the great thing about China is it's kind of, somebody once said that the history of the Western world is the rise and fall of many civilizations, whereas in China, it's the rise and fall of one civilization through many dynasties. And sometimes it breaks apart for quite a while, but it comes back together again.
There was a hand there.
Hi, Michael. I'm intrigued to know how you researched your journey and how you actually undertook your journey.
So the question was how you researched your journey and how you undertook it.
Yeah, difficult bits, actually. You look around and online, and I've got a good Chinese friend in London Tina, who looks things up for me, and like the journey from Qinzhou over the mountains down through in Sichuan down to Chengdu, which was horrendous for the family. They're literally starving and frozen, a horrendous journey through that winter. And a lot of it is quite wild places. And I just said, you couldn't just look up and see what you can find on this. And somebody, only 2017 or 18, some dear local fan, a local bloke, had done an article about that stretch of the journey. He'd gone by car, so he admitted he hadn't done everything, but he'd stopped in all the places. He'd put photographs in. He'd done this lovely piece for just a local magazine. So I said, give him a ring, Tina. So you kind of, making contact with people on the ground was really great. And that happened over the music too. It was fairly late in the day that I feel so ignorant that I'd not much earlier on in my life realized that a lot of Chinese classical poetry is sung. And then I was in Changsha, I think, and a local professor, she said, there's still a tradition of this singing. And I went, what? And she picked up her iPhone and played me a minute of a woman in the countryside in Changsha singing the famous poem about the musician Li Guanyan and who he meets, the refugees. It's like the Second World War in Casablanca or something, and he's down on the river in near Changsha, and he meets the great musician who he'd seen decades ago, and writes a very short poem which all Chinese kids learn because it's one of the set texts in school. And
they are trying to recreate some of the instruments.
they're
aren't
trying
they,
to
now as well?
and actually the scholar in Changsha her students are trying to recreate the Tang Dynasty instruments and work out the settings of these things. So this is just the kind of probably wasn't really necessary for such a simple journey on one level, because when you're doing a film you can't do every stop. We only did 2.5 weeks on the road, so we were doing by car, train over the mountains, but a boat for a period down the Yangtze. But you follow things up, and actually once I'd got in touch with the woman who was now the custodian of the singing tradition in the Changsha countryside, I kept sending her messages saying, "Oh, can you sing me the first verse of Autumn Wastes?" And next day it will be there, you know. And so there's a whole other dimension to it. So actually in the book I got a friend of mine to transcribe the music that she sang for the Li Guanyan poem in Western musical notation. So it's actually in the book, so you can see. So that's kind of how I work in researching any kind of film, that you do the broad research. There's a lot of work being done on Du Fu's journeys in Chinese, of course, but a lot of good things have been written in the last 40 years on Du Fu. But so you can find out about the spots that have been remembered. And but when you go on the ground, then it's another dimension, you know. Fortunately, Tina's mum and her second husband live in Pinjiang, which is a little town near to Changsha, and almost the nearest big town to Du Fu's tomb. And so when I was thinking about it, I said, "Oh, can you ask Uncle Yang to go and do a little recce for us?" So Uncle Yang went to the tomb site, which is a fabulous place. It's a just beautiful, beautiful place. There's photographs that I took are in the book. And Yang sent me photos back, and he talked to the family. And of course there is one group of the Du Fu family, one of the sons, had stayed in the area to tend the father's tomb. And they're still there. And every year they do a little thing on the Feast of the Ancestors, the Qingming Festival. And Mrs. Du makes cakes and tea for people when they come. And now even the kids from the local school come and do a little ceremonial. But the Du family have always done that. Mr. Du didn't figure much in the film, I'm afraid, because he was a little too fond of drink too early in the day.
But I wonder where he got that from.
I wonder where he got that from. But so things like that, where you do the journey, but you know that you're going to arrive, and that you know what the location looks like, and you know who's going to be there, but things always happen. Things happen off the cuff. I just wish we'd had longer to film, actually, because there's so many great things. We hadn't.
And it's available on iPlayer at the moment, that film, isn't it?
Yeah, it was shown again on the BBC last Monday.
With Ian McKellen reading some of the poetry as well. Yeah.
Ian McKellen's fantastic, as you can imagine.
Yeah.
We were slightly worried about cultural appropriation, having a non-Chinese person reading Chinese poetry. These days, you've got to be aware of all this. But we couldn't find anybody among the British Chinese actors who quite had that powerful emotive sense. And we asked Ian McKellen, whether he would do it, and sent him some of the poems. He said, "I'd love to do it." So McKellen did it, and the film went out. But when it went out on CCTV in China, the amazing thing was that everybody loved McKellen's performance, and the funny thing was the Chinese audience were all going, "He looks exactly like Du Fu," because the Chinese imagination of Du Fu is this old guy with a wispy beard, and and it was perfect, And of course, his readings were just brilliant.
And your book is being published in China, isn't it? And there is great anticipation by the sound of it.
There is in our household, because the book, of course, is a labour of love. It was not a book that I had any expectation it would sell many copies. So, although John Simpson wrote a wonderful review of it in The Guardian, if you look at Guardian online, but I've no great hopes that it's going to sell many copies in the UK. It was a labour of love. It was something discharging my obligations to Du Fu, who I've loved since I was 15, and so a labour of love. But then the Chinese publisher said that they wanted to publish it, and then you're into a completely different world of literary audiences. You know, I mean, I was saying to Anne before we came on, we did a series of films on how China got rich on the Deng Xiaoping opening up 40 years ago. We did a promo on my iPhone in our front room, and got 100 million hits in 24 hours on the Tencent website. And it became a news story in China, the number of hits. And I said to my wife, Rebecca, I said, God, if only a tiny portion of them buy the Du Fu book, we can retire comfortably.
Well,
or maybe do the book on Li Qingzhao.
If you would like to contribute to Michael's retirement fund, the book is available for sale next door. I can heartily recommend it. It's fascinating. Du Fu is such an interesting character, and Michael's way of exploring his life and his work is so intriguing and so engrossing. So I heartily recommend you get a copy. But in the meantime, I would ask you to join me in thanking Michael Wood.
Thanks a lot.